Hey friends, welcome back to the 1 Year Bible Journey. I'm Pastor Cary. This is Growing in the Gospel, and we are in week 32 of the 1 Year Bible Journey, especially for beginners. And this particular video is our video for the New Testament of week 32. So after today, we have 20 weeks left. That's 40 videos from right now. And I just congratulate you. And some of you have been right with me week by week. Some of you are taking this every other week or whatever pace. Hey, don't worry about your pace. Just keep pressing forward. And we're on a good journey. This week's reading is Old Testament, Job 38 to 42, and Proverbs 1 to 10. We talked about that in the Old Testament video for week 32. And now today, for week 32, New Testament, we're reading 2 Corinthians 1 through 5. And so what are we up against as we turn the page from 1 Corinthians to 2 Corinthians? Now, we talked a lot about the story of the church at Corinth. We've had a couple of glimpses of that, first in the book of Acts and then in the book of 1 Corinthians. And so I'm not going to rehearse the entire detailed history, but I do want to remind you of the high points as we start now 2 Corinthians. Remember this, 1 Corinthians was a book of correction. It was a rebuke to a church. It was a problem church, crazy church, and Paul was correcting things. So here's the quick story of the church at Corinth. Paul ended up in Corinth alone, didn't want to be there, wanted to be in Thessalonica. His friends, new church friends, Timothy and Silas. Timothy and Silas were back in Thessalonica. And so he's alone, gets a job, meets Aquila and Priscilla, makes tents. He's there for 18 months. Doesn't start really preaching the gospel full time until Timothy and Silas show up from Thessalonica with an offering, with good news. The church is doing well. Paul was at one of his two lowest emotional moments in his first few months at Corinth. But God was doing deep work. We've talked about that story, and it's a great story. So later in the time there, a great church explodes. Jesus says to Paul, I have much people in this city, and no one's going to hurt you, so preach on. God gives Paul a year and a half of fruitful preaching and teaching in a church there in Corinth. The church was meeting in the house of a man named Justus, and the house was connected to the synagogue. So that means it was in the poorer part of the city, and that probably most of the first or earliest members were Jewish people. There was a little bit of turmoil there, but then the church really exploded not only with Jewish people, but with many others. And as you read this book, you're going to get a sense, and 1 Corinthians, you're going to get a sense that it was really the lower class people of the city, not many mighty, not many noble, okay? It was the lower class people, or the more impoverished people, or the more everyday people that had become Christians and believers and were part of this church. But it was a mixed group of both Jews and Gentiles, a multi-ethnic group. And over time, this cosmopolitan, very materialistic, very commercialized, very sensual, sexualized city, very pagan city, this church grew up and was thriving. So after Paul left, the church fell into some problems, and it became divided. It became polarized over personalities. It became very competitive. There were sin problems in the church, which we talked about through the book of 1 Corinthians. And Paul sent Timothy to try to get the course back, to correct the course. That didn't go well. And so he wrote the letter that we know as 1 Corinthians, okay? Now, there's two theories on this. The one theory is that there's 3 letters to the Corinthian church, and the other theory is that there's 4 letters to the Corinthian church, and that 1 Corinthians would have been the second letter he wrote, and that 2 Corinthians would have been the 4th letter he wrote. I'm not going to get into the weeds of all that conjecture. I'll just leave it this way. When you connect the dots and get the breadcrumbs of the way the story unfolds, it could have been 3, it could have been 4. What we know for sure is the church had fallen into some sin problems, and that when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, and sent it to them by way of Timothy, it didn't go well. They did not receive it. The leaders rose up in defiance and rebellion, and they rejected the correction that Paul sent through Timothy. So Timothy gets word, brings back word to Paul, or maybe gets word to Paul. And Paul, while he's at Ephesus, he was there for 3.5 years, pastoring the church at Ephesus, he made a trip to Corinth to try to get the church back on course. When he got there, he was confronted and rejected very hurtfully. And so Paul, in pain and in rejection, returned to Ephesus. Rather than destroy or divide or break the church further, he received the rejection and left humbly, and giving this to the Lord and letting some time work through this. But he was in great distress over this church. So he goes back to Ephesus. It's not long after that he's in danger at Ephesus, so he leaves. And he makes his way across Turkey to the northwest side of Turkey to a city called Troas. And when he gets to Troas, he has a great open door to preach the gospel. He's going to tell us in this letter, 2 Corinthians, that he couldn't do it because his emotions were, he was in such distress, he thought he was going to die. He's going to say that in chapter 1. He was in grave emotional distress. He couldn't even preach the gospel in a wide open door. It's the only time in his entire ministry where he admits that he had an open door, but he couldn't do it. So he leaves Troas because he has sent Titus, by the way, as he's journeyed to Troas, he sent Titus to Corinth. They didn't receive Timothy. They didn't receive the letter. So he sends Titus. Titus was a very diplomatic young man and apparently a good leader because he not only helped to patch things up at Corinth, he then was left later at the island of Crete to disempower self-appointed false teachers and appoint leaders and organize the churches on the island of Crete. So Titus had some really good leadership gifts and diplomacy gifts. He really was gifted in this way. So Titus goes to Corinth, but Paul is waiting and waiting and waiting for news from Titus. And you remember, this is first century travel, and news travels slowly and people travel slowly. So because he's waiting in Troas and nothing's coming, he can't sit still, and he leaves. And I think Timothy's with him, and they go across the Aegean Sea to Macedonia, which is northern Greece, to try to find and meet up with Titus. Finally, they meet up with Titus I think it's in Philippi. When he meets up with Titus, Titus brings good news. Whew. Big relief, huge relief. The church had received a middle letter, not 1 Corinthians, but a letter in between 1 and 2 Corinthians through Titus. They had received what Paul called a tearful letter, a letter he had written with much tears, calling them, pleading with them to repent, warning the unruly, warning the rebels, but pleading with them to respond better than to the first letter. Titus comes back and says, it's all resolved. The church has repented. The sinning brother that was committing incest has repented. The church has been restored to Paul. They are favorable towards Paul. Everything's been healed back up. So Paul is elated. He is extremely happy. And so from Philippi in Macedonia, he writes this letter, 2 Corinthians, which is either the third or fourth letter. And he writes them now with a totally different tone. And this is a very, very good letter, and it's very personal. So a couple things I want to tell you, very high end, and we'll break the letter down. This is one of Paul's most personable letters. He's most open-hearted. He's most emotional. He's most passionate and personable and honest. He's just raw and open. He is gushing with love. He's trying to strengthen and bless. He is trying to strengthen those that were repentant, and he's trying to win back the resistant minority, those that were holdouts, still not sure of him. And he is trying to really patch things up, cleanly in preparation for his final visit to the church at Corinth. He's making plans to go back and visit. Okay, so this letter has 7 sections when you include the introduction and the conclusion. And I'm going to break it down briefly for you. And it's kind of it's not as cleanly divided as some of the other books of the Bible, because Paul is more or less meandering. I mean, there's themes that keep coming back and repeating themselves, and there's a ton of practical instruction and theological insight and shepherdly care. But Paul's purposes are really embedded in this letter emotionally and relationally. So chapter 1, verses 1 to 12 is really the introduction, the greetings, and the opening. When you get to verse 12 through chapter 2, verse 11, he's explaining, I would just say it's explanations. He's explaining his travel plans. He's explaining why his visit has been delayed. And he's explaining how to restore the man that he told them in 1 Corinthians to cast out of the church. The man that was publicly destroying the church with his fornication and incest and flaunting it, if you remember that. That man has now been repentant. And so Paul says, let's restore him and let's not let him get swallowed up in regret. Beautiful passage. The third part of this letter begins in chapter 2 and verse 12 and goes through chapter 6 about verse 10. And I'm just going to call this the defense of his ministry. But it's a defense that's also filled with all kinds of practical instruction. So we're going to learn a lot of theology and a lot of practical life instruction about how to do ministry and how to do life. But you need to understand the motive, the underlying motive behind it all is that he is defending how he ministered to them. He is reminding them of the validity and the authenticity and the sincerity of his ministry through all the suffering and all the nuances of it. And there's just a lot here. It's really, really good. And then part 4 begins in chapter 6, verse 11 to 7, verse 16. And that is exhortations, when he's essentially saying to the church, I want you to have an open heart towards me. I want to help your faith. I want to increase your joy. I want to invest and pour into you, but I need you to open your heart to me. It's there's a lot of leadership lessons in this book. One of them is that when your integrity is coming into question, it's okay to defend it. And when your ministry is being maligned, it's okay to defend it to those you minister to. When the church is divided over something, it's okay for the leader to address it. And in this case, when there's a sincere heart in the leader to try to bless and love and serve, it's okay to ask people to open their hearts towards that. And he encouraged them to still separate from those that are making trouble. So that's the exhortations. Part 5, I would just call an invitation or a solicitation. And that's chapters 8 and 9. We'll talk more about this next week, but those are chapters on giving. We learn a lot about Christian giving from those 2 chapters because he's asking them to prepare an offering for the Christians at Jerusalem. So like I said, we'll talk about that next week. The next section, part 6, is in chapters 10 through 13 and verse 10, and that is vindication. This he again defends his apostleship, not just how he did ministry. He's not just recounting his suffering and his sincerity. Now he is vindicating his authority and his apostolic authority. And why? Because there were some holdouts. There were some people in the church that had come behind him and dismantled his influence and questioned his authority and discredited him for no reason. And so he is restoring his credibility with this church and with people that he very much loves. And then part 7 is the conclusion of the letter in chapter 13, verses 11 to 14. So 4 overarching reasons why Paul is writing this book. What are his motives? First, comfort. One of the key words in this book, repeating over and over, is the word comfort. And so we're going to see the comfort of God all the way through it. And Paul begins with the God of all comfort. And out of his suffering and out of his distress, how God is the source of his comfort. And in relation to restoring that sinning brother who's repentant, comforting him. The second motive for Paul writing this letter was to explain his changing plans and his intention to come and visit them and his plans for that visit. The third reason for writing this letter was to call them to participate in generosity and stewardship and in a special offering for the church at Jerusalem. The fourth reason was the defense of his own apostleship and the authenticity of his own ministry. Now, those four motives kind of go back and forth throughout the whole book. There's certain sections that are more obviously one motive over another. But I just want you to remember as you're reading this letter that these are the reasons for the writing of this letter, and the context of the story has changed now. We're not dealing so much with troubled church as we're dealing, or crazy church, as we're now dealing with a recovering church. We're dealing with a church that's coming back to unity, coming back to health, and Paul is writing towards that. And he is restoring with them. He is validating his own ministry and motives and authority to continue leading and directing them. He is bringing comfort and encouragement and admonition. He is preparing them for financial generosity and teaching them how to think about it, how to think about giving. And then he is explaining some things about his plans, his visit, and what's to come. So let's break down real quickly, and I won't be much longer, the 5 chapters you're going to read this week. Chapter 1 is mostly greetings and blessing and comfort. Paul specifically talks about when he was despairing of his own life, and then why his plans have changed, and how he desires, and the heart of every true pastor or faithful pastor is this, to be a helper of their joy and not to merely have dominion over their faith. He's saying, hey, I'm not trying to just relish authority here. I need to operate in authority under the assignment of God. That's part of what validates my call. But he's saying, no, my desire is to be a helper of your joy. And I would say to you, my friends, that is my desire as I'm doing these videos. Chapter 2, he says, I want to visit again, but I don't want to come with heaviness. I want the repentant brother to be restored, and I want you to know I've really struggled in the emotional distress of what happened between us. And then he begins to defend his ministry. Chapter 3, I don't need to commend myself. You are the best evidence of my ministry. The new covenant, the ministry of God's Spirit, the plainness of my speech. God uses these things and changes us through them. But he is defending his ministry in a very noble way, in a very honest, open-hearted, indirect way. Chapter 4, he continues these ideas that we are fragile vessels, but the sincerity of our gospel ministry is in our honesty. And our ministry is validated through even suffering. He recounts the suffering they went through and continue to go through. And that's a way that their faithfulness validates the authenticity and the sincerity of their ministry. Chapter 5, Paul basically expounds that his ministry is driven by hope and by authenticity. And he refers to those that are judging him by appearance, but expresses that God is judging our hearts and the sincerity of our hearts and our ministry, and that we are driven by the love of Christ. The love of Christ constrains us, and we are not beholden to man's fleshly opinions. We don't answer to man's opinions or earthly judges, because we are new creatures. We are reconciled to God. We are his ambassadors, and so we answer to him. When you come to the end of chapter 5, one of the greatest gospel verses in all of the New Testament, 2 Corinthians 5:21, for he hath made him to be sin for us who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. This is called the great exchange. And this is one example of what I'm talking about when I say Paul is defending, he's validating his ministry and his way of ministering, but in so doing, he's also instructing us on the theological foundation of our ministry and the deep motivations of our ministry, and telling us that we answer to God. We've been reconciled to God. It's God that's driving us and leading us forward. It's God that's compelling us with his love. These chapters are great, great chapters filled with so much instruction embedded in the way that Paul was defending his ministry. So we're going to pause the reading right there, just 5 short chapters, and then we're going to pick it up in chapter 6 next week, unless you're like me and sometimes you get caught up in the reading and you're enjoying yourself and you go ahead and read ahead. That's just fine too. But that is a quick snapshot of what is the second letter to Corinthians. What is the story, again, behind the church at Corinth? And why is Paul writing this letter? So Godspeed in your reading this week. I would love to read your comments about what God is teaching you and how he's working in your life through the 1-year Bible journey. But I'm here to tell you that you are now complete with week 32, and we press on to week 33. Very quickly, don't forget the Done book. If you know people that need the gospel, this book is available in quantity at a very steep discount, and a lot of people give these to people that deliver food or packages at their door. I told a story yesterday about someone that puts them in with packages they sell online. Many people give them to coworkers or friends or neighbors or give them away as gifts. I can't even tell you the number of stories that I hear in a given week about people that trusted Christ because they read Done. So I praise God for the fruit of this book, and I just put it out to you as a resource that's in your hands, that can be in your hands, to give the gospel to people that you love and care about. It's available at inthegospel.com, inthegospel.com, and I hope you'll use it for God's glory. So that is week 32. Thanks for joining me. See you next time.